Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today at ASME's virtual town hall. As you know, this is a series of events designed to help the ASME community stay connected on science and engineering public policies and the issues of today. Today is also a very special day for many of us. It's International Women's Day, so please join me in a quiet way or a loud way in celebrating International Women's Day. We're pretty excited about it. What we're also excited about is I'd like to welcome Congressman Dan Kildee. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to having a very engaging conversation and discussion with our community. Our community is especially excited to have Congressman Kildee join us, as he's been a leader in Congress on so many issues important to the science and engineering community, especially clean water and aging infrastructure issues that have impacted the city of Flint, Michigan, which he represents. And with that, I'd like to provide a quick introduction of the Congressman for our audience. Born and raised in Flint, Congressman Dan Kildee is a lifelong Michigander. He is serving his 5th term in Congress for the people of Michigan's 5th district, and he has become a leading advocate in Congress for protecting drinking water resources, revitalizing cities, promoting infrastructure, and workforce development issues. Congressman Kildee brings a wealth of experience in state and local issues with him to Congress. In fact, he won his first public office right out of high school. He was just 18 when he won a seat on the Flint Board of Education. Congressman, a personal thank you for doing that. Very admirable. He also served as the Genesee County Treasurer on the Genesee County Board of Commissioners and co-founded and served as president of the Center for Community Progress, a national nonprofit organization focused on urban land and reform revitalization. He also founded Michigan's first land bank, the Genesee County Land Bank, which is responsible for tens of millions of dollars in redevelopment in Flint. He serves on the House Budget Committee, the Science, Space and Technology Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, which includes jurisdiction over a number of important tax and trade issues. He has also been selected by his colleagues to serve as the Chief Deputy Whip of the House Democratic Caucus as part of the House Leadership and Messaging Team. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping issues. I'd like our audience to know that during the question and answer, attendees should raise their hand, use the raise their hand function, and ASME staff member will give you the floor by unmuting yourself. I also encourage participants to submit questions throughout the event in the chat function, and we will work to address as many questions as time permits. With that, I'll turn things over to the Congressman. We'd love to hear a little bit on the congressional agenda. And again, Congressman Kildee, thank you very much for joining us today. Sir, the floor is all yours.
Well, first of all, thank you, Tom, and thank you to ASME for inviting me to participate today. It comes at an important time. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and much of our focus has logically been on what we need to do to address that issue. Tonight and tomorrow, we'll take in the House the final steps in passing the most recent Pandemic Relief Act, or to the President's desk. And of course, our hope and our desire is, of course, that is the beginning of the end, that the light at the end of the tunnel actually is something we can look forward to. And more importantly, in some ways, that we can then turn our attention to some of the issues that we clearly need to address outside of the context of the pandemic. But in this case, one that would in some ways be beneficial, and that is infrastructure. And as you know, an organization that I'm sure you work with, the American Society of Civil Engineers, gives American infrastructure a D+ rating. We have to move on to significant large-scale investment in infrastructure over a long term, because obviously the size of the problem, the American Society of Civil Engineers pegs it at over $4 trillion in terms of what our infrastructure deficit is. The size of that problem requires us to take a long-term approach so that we benefit over a longer period of time, and so that we can prepare ourselves and train the workers we need to do this really important work. It's also critical because it's how we stay competitive. You know, there's a lot of focus. I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, as Tom said in my introduction. A lot of our focus naturally within our jurisdiction is on global trade and how the U.S. can engage globally in trading partnerships that are beneficial to us and actually also beneficial to the rest of the world. Investing in infrastructure, investing in our capacity to produce and transport goods most efficiently across the globe and within our own country helps us be more competitive in that environment. And in many ways, those investments pay us back with increased productivity and the inputs that come with those outputs. In some ways, to an extent, will pay for themselves. It's critical when we address this, and the hope is that within the next couple of months, this will become our focus. Rebuilding America's aging infrastructure, thinking about how we engineer a 21st century infrastructure. It's also important that we size the investment equal to the size of the problem. As I said, a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure gap doesn't improve itself naturally. It has to happen because we are intentional about it. So on the Ways and Means Committee, aside from trade, we're also responsible for financing, for bringing in the resources. We are the committee that deals with taxation. And so it's important that we look at all avenues to finance, to fund the kind of infrastructure investment equal to the scale of the problem that we really need. Now, that will include potentially raising some revenue. It will also, I think, include us taking a look at how we finance long-term improvements. And it's really important to keep in mind, there's a lot of debate, legitimate, critical, important debate about the size of the American government's national debt. Totally get that. It's a real problem. It's a moral and an economic question. But let's not fall into a trap of somehow believing that should limit our ability to finance infrastructure improvements the way local governments might finance infrastructure improvement, borrowing money over the long term with the idea that what we build will pay us back with dividends, with increased productivity, with a better, more productive country, with society that's a 21st century society. And with that, some increased revenues that come with an economy that continues to grow. I often compare infrastructure financing the way I think about a home mortgage. You ask somebody how much debt they have, typically they'll tell you about their unsecured debt. They very often won't look at the balance on their mortgage minus, or the equity on their home minus the balance on their mortgage to calculate their debt. They know that there's an asset on the other side of the ledger. So we don't think about that the same way we think about other debt. That's how we have to look at infrastructure. It's also important that when we design this effort, that we think about it in as complete a fashion as we can. Obviously, infrastructure includes the conventional transportation infrastructure that we think about generally when we talk about infrastructure, but it's also important that we look at all of the deficits in the physical environment that can be addressed with a thoughtful infrastructure plan. Specifically, and this is where my past work really informs my thinking on this, specifically looking at older industrial cities that have had a more difficult time making the transition to the 21st century economy. The natural ebb and flow of an economy, the natural changes that occur as a result of globalization, the natural and predictable effects of disruptions caused by the changing manufacturing environment, by technology, has disparate impacts on communities. And some communities were so heavily invested in and anchored to the older manufacturing economy that even with good leadership in those communities, it's difficult to make that transition. And so many of those communities are left with vacant and abandoned structures, with obsolete facilities, with water, sewer, and transportation infrastructure that is sized for a community much larger than the reality of the 21st century. I think about my own hometown, Flint, once had almost 200,000 people. This year's census numbers should show at just over 90,000. It's really difficult to think about how an infrastructure design and an outlay for a community of 200,000 can be supported by a community of 90,000 people. So we have to rethink, re-engineer, redesign, and rebuild those places in a way that does not adhere to the conventional notions that all communities are always in a constant state of growth. Some of our older industrial cities need some extra help to get back to the starting line. So we want to make sure that whatever infrastructure package we put together recognizes that reality. So, I mean, obviously we go beyond that too. We need to address the technology disparities, the lack of access to broadband, for example, in some communities, keep them out of the economy. And that has to be a necessary part of infrastructure. Last year, and I was talking to Tom before, he knows Representative Peter DeFazio and had worked with him. Last year through Representative DeFazio's leadership, we passed the Moving Forward Act, which was a comprehensive investment in America's infrastructure. It would have done a lot to address so many of these big issues that we face. We have to take that up and I think go even bigger. So I know this is a priority for the Biden administration. It's certainly a priority that should be a bipartisan priority. I think it can be. And I hope that's the way we approach this. We're in a tough time. Partisanship is often a difficult thing to overcome, but I've never seen a Democratic or Republican road or water system or sewer system. And we ought to figure out a way to come together around this. I think it would be good for the country. And I think it would perhaps help Congress overcome some of the divisions that have divided us in the last few years. We also want to make sure that as we grow the economy, that we're supporting the development of domestically produced products, American-made products. The Make It in America Jobs Plan is something that I've supported for a long time. I know the president is focused on this. He recently signed an executive order to prioritize, particularly for the federal government procurement, to prioritize American-made products. We can do all this and still be very thoughtful and protective of the greatest asset that I know I represent, our people and our land, particularly the land and water assets of my home state of Michigan. They're not just important because they define who we are. They are really critical to our long-term economic future. I represent 118 miles of Lake Huron shoreline. So as we grow, as we invest, we have to make sure that we do so in a way that protects those natural assets that we have. So we can do this. It requires thoughtful design and engineering in order to grow the economy in a way that does protect our natural environment. And a lot of that focus will be on clean energy technology. And that's why I've been so focused on moving ahead with the development of electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, using the tax code as a way to incentivize private investment, both from the consumer and from the manufacturer, into these carbon reduced emission vehicles. And particularly my focus has been on more electric vehicles. I have the Driving America Forward Act, which is the consumer tax credit for electric vehicles. This is an important question that we're going to be answering just in the next few months. And I believe it fits very nicely in an infrastructure plan because it has us incentivizing the kind of development and the kind of investment that will allow us to grow our economy and do so in a way that protects the planet.
Congressman, I know you're a busy guy. We appreciate everything you've done for us. I know you'd like to get back to what you're doing. Again, just a quick shout out and a special thank you to your Chief of Staff, Mitchell, also to Elizabeth and Jason. They're a pleasure to work with, Congressman. We thank you. We've got many more questions than we have time for. So our thanks again. I'll see you shortly on the Hill and appreciate everything you've done for us. So enjoy the rest of your day, sir.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks to everybody. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Enjoy your day.